Hello, and today we're going to be looking at a scenario where Austria-Hungary was a great power before World War One. Of course, here they control all of southern Germany, Silesia, minor territories from Serbia, and all of Venice and Milan. They also control colonies in Western Sahara, Namibia, Madagascar, and Somalia. How this happens is not important. We're just going to assume that somehow everything else went the exact same except for the fact that Austria-Hungary controls a ton more territories. Along with that, from now on, I'm just going to be calling them Austria. As with all of these extra German territories, and with them doing much better overall, Hungary wouldn't have nearly as much influence, and it would likely still just be Austria. Pushing right into it, I'd like to talk about the new sides that would form. Of course, the staple of the time period before World War I was the Germo-Austrian alliance versus the Franco-Russian alliance. This would be completely different here, as all of these lands taken from Germany would turn Germany into an enemy. Along with this, the Russians may actually end up aligning themselves with Germany. Perhaps if they're willing to give up something like Memel, the Russians would much rather have all of Galicia, lands from the Ottomans, lands in other areas, rather than just Memel. So I'm going to be putting Russia, funnily enough, on the German side. And we can just assume that they already had Memel because things went differently at some point, blah blah blah. Point is, Russia and Germany are far, far better off. As for the Austrian side, we are going to have, of course, this very, very strong Austria, and quite possibly the UK as well, they would far prefer the Austrians over the Germans and the Russians. Despite all this expansion, they are still fairly unstable and not the most industrialized. With Germany weakened, Russia would be their main threat, with Germany and Austria kind of competing for the number 2 spot there. However, Germany and Russia would absolutely get Italy as an ally. Italy wants back Venice, they want back Milan, they want to take back their lands and beat up the Austrians. And as for Austria's final ally, they are going to get the French on their side. They want Alsace-Lorraine. The Italians don't like them, and there's really no conflicts between Austria and France. As for some of the minor powers, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro would likely join up with the Russians and the Germans, while Bulgaria and the Ottomans would likely join the just the Austrians and the British. Let's go ahead and start off by saying I don't know which side would be the aggressor, and I couldn't tell you how this war would start. Maybe it goes the exact same way and the Archduke is shot in Sarajevo, or maybe it's completely different. There's really no way of telling. But immediately the Austrians would be on the back foot. Germany would not attempt a Schlieffen plan. There is no reason for them to do so. And the Austrians would immediately begin to fall. We're going to assume they just gained all these... Well, no. We're going to assume that they are stronger, that they gained these territories over time, that their government is more stable, etc., especially without the Hungarians having so much power. So they're actually going to do okay here despite being surrounded. A minor Romanian invasion, even a possible Montenegrin push to the coast to start to get some Italian aid, and of course, most importantly, a Russian push into Galicia. Russia would also start an invasion into Armenia. However, the Ottomans don't have to deal with the front line in Egypt. They don't have to deal with the front line in Kuwait. They don't even have to deal with the front line in the Mediterranean. Anywhere else, they can focus all their strength on this Russian line. So despite their Ottoman weakness, they would probably do quite well here. Meanwhile, over in Austria, they would be falling back slowly. Germany has the more professional and stronger army, and they would be making progress into Bavaria and into Silesia. However, the French, who don't have a massive front line to deal with, and frankly the Italians are no threat, would push into the Alsace and meet up with the Austrians to have a much more unified front line. From here, the lines would sort of stabilize. No pushes would be made into the Alps, and it's very likely that the Austrians could stop the Italians before they reach Venice. After that, the Italians are sort of going to become useless. They simply don't... in our own timeline, they were quite useless against the Austrians. Here, the Austrians are stronger and they're weaker, so we're going to assume they can't do much more. Meanwhile, over in the Balkans, The Bulgarians are going to be making a lot of progress into Macedonia and up into Romania. In fact, they may completely capitulate Serbia very quickly. I purposely gave Austria the Serbia's capital city, heavily weakening them, and without the river as a defensive point, the Austrians could make a much, much easier push in. They would soon capitulate Montenegro, and I doubt Serbia would last much longer than that. Albania may even join the war as well, as they were the Austro-Hungarians were great friends with them, and they wouldn't mind getting some lands from Serbia. Meanwhile, Bulgaria would now be able to focus all of their attention up into Romania. Along with an Austro-Hungarian push, Romania would fall as well, and Bulgarian troops would start to fight the Russians. During all this time, the French would have been inching into Alsace-Lorraine. As, like I said, Italy's no threat, and the German army is very dispersed among the front line, along with being weaker than in our timeline. In fact, Germany would still be stronger than France, but not by much. They would be pretty equal in strength in this timeline. And with the German army dispersed while the French one is concentrated, a push into the Rhineland could be likely. We would also see Italy start to get pushed back. As I mentioned, they're not the strongest, and their initial invasion wouldn't really do much at all. The Russians would be the only ones still seeing progress, as together with the Germans they would be pushing into Bohemia and continuing to push down into Galicia. Their hope would be to capitulate the Austrians from the north, capturing Prague and Budapest, and if they can capitulate Austria, it is very likely that they could win this war. Meanwhile, the Ottomans are actually going to start an offensive into Russia. As crazy as this might sound, I honestly see this as being likely. As I mentioned, the Ottomans have no other front lines, and if anything, they would be gaining British help and British aid, even British troops in this offensive. As the British would be a lot in naval campaigns, holding naval dominance and sending aid to all front lines. Aid would be pouring into Austria-Hungary from the Mediterranean from the British, and it's even possible the British naval invade Sardinia and Corsica at some point. This would just further cut off the Italians. They're alone, they are fully embargoed, and they will be the first to fall. The Austrians would start an offensive, the French would push past the Alps and start an offensive. Soon all of northern Italy, the most important and industrial part of the peninsula, would fall. The British would land in the south, and Italy as a whole would surrender. They were simply surrounded and outmatched in every way. From here, the British and the French would focus on a push into the Rhineland, and with the fall of their most industrial lands, the Germans would be falling apart. The Russians would attempt one final push towards the key city of Prague, and they would actually manage to take it as the Austrians were far too distracted. This, however, wouldn't allow the Russians to push past the mountains over here in northern Hungary, and it would just be, although a victory, a delaying one at best, as the Bulgarians are starting to push into core Russian, well, not core, but actual Russian territory. The Ottomans would also continue their offensive, as despite their very weak country, as I've mentioned, they are in an amazing position here. The Austrians would mainly leave the fighting in the Rhineland and in Bavaria to the French and the British, as they focus on reconquering Bohemia, Moravia, and Galicia. The French offensive would continue to gain strength, as the Germans, most German people wouldn't even want to continue this war anymore. They see no reason to keep fighting when their options are just join Austria or fight in a war that you are going to lose. Austria might even at this point take on the role of Germany in the name of Germany. They control more than half of all German speakers, so this would make sense. However, a lot of minorities in their south would be greatly against this, as obviously Hungarians don't want to be a part of Germany. The British would consolidate the north of Germany, quite possibly even capturing Hamburg and the Kiel Canal. From here, Germany may even fully surrender. Their Silesian offensive is falling apart, and the Austrians themselves have pushed into Saxony. This German capitulation would end the war completely. It is Russia versus the world, and soon enough they would be on the complete back foot. However, I'm not sure if they would suffer a complete capitulation like in our timeline. The British aren't looking to send men to capture Moscow. The French don't want to see troops dying in Ukraine. The Austrians would love to keep pushing, and the Ottomans are making some slow but steady progress. However, pushing in and completely capturing Russia is simply unrealistic. So, after capturing a few more important cities like Riga, and quite possibly even Kiev, the war would end. The Russians could, in theory, hold out for years longer, but I think they would agree to some sort of conditional peace, as it is obvious to everyone who has won. In this peace treaty, the Albanians, clearly the most important, would take a lot of Serbian lands, and even a decent bit of Montenegrin lands, as the country would be completely and totally destroyed. This new Albanian state would go on to become a major superpower, rivaling the likes of the United States, as no one could truly compete with Albania after gaining Kosovo and parts of Macedonia. The Bulgarians, meanwhile, would only gain like 3 times the land in Macedonia and in southern Serbia. Still nice, I guess, but not really much. In fact, they may even gain more of Serbia, as Austria would just want to completely destroy them as a country. Gaining all of Nice would be a major win for Bulgaria, and despite there being a lot of Serbians, they would still be quite stable. They would also push up the Mediterranean coast of Romania, capturing all of the lands up along the Danube, establishing that as a powerful border with the Romanians and possibly the Austrians. From here, I even see it as a possibility that Austria totally annexes what's left of Serbia. There's really no reason for the rump state to exist. And from here, I'm going to show you what I'm going to do to the Austrians. They do hold a lot of minorities, and it is making them very, very unstable. So, they're going to do what a lot of people think they should have done in our timeline. Create a series of semi-independent states. The first would, of course, be Illyria, or even possibly Yugoslavia, depends on what they want to name it. And the second would be Hungary. That is horrible Hungarian borders. Pfft. That is also horrible Hungarian borders. Let's go ahead and put in the third first, which would be Poland. Poland would be created as a state and would then be expanded significantly down into Austrian lands, taking all of Galicia while joining them as another crown. They wouldn't even be crowns, they would just be extremely independent regions, as I see a few more being created. Quite possibly Austria, and I'm just doing this because I think it would be really funny here, and there's a bunch of history I didn't go over simply because I don't know how this would have happened, but they would create kind of their own states of Europe. Romania would join as well, taking small lands from the Austrians while losing the south to Bulgaria. The Romanians would also be given all of Moldova, meaning that they would actually expand after completely losing the war. Just something I find a bit interesting, similar to how Bulgaria grew after World War II. Hungary would of course be another one of the factions and among the stronger ones. However, they would be far more balanced between Poland, Hungary, Illyria, and Romania, as none of them are truly that much more powerful than the others. Meanwhile, in Germany, of course, the French would seize Alsace-Lorraine, and possibly the Saarland and surrounding territories as well. This is simply a given. They took these lands themselves and they're going to keep them. However, the British may actually help the French in gaining a Rhinish puppet, as Austria is extremely strong here, and seeing as they're probably going to annex the rest of Germany, the British want to do as much as they can to limit that new strength. Otherwise, the balance in Europe will be completely destroyed. Another thing they do without an American intervention in the war is force Denmark to take even more lands in northern Germany. As for Poland, they would be greatly expanded into Posen and into Prussia. Actually, they may not even take Prussia, but they would for sure take the corridor and many Polish majority regions in the south. As for Prussia itself, I could see it being turned into its own area. I honestly couldn't tell you what's going to happen to it. I'm, in this scenario, going to unite it with Austria. However, it could go to Poland. It could become a separate state, as it is disconnected by land. I honestly couldn't tell you. However, here they are going to join Austria. As for Italy, the problem here is that even if Austria wanted to turn them into a state of the Austrian Confederation, they really couldn't. Italy is too large and too strong to just be subjugated like Romania and Serbia were, or like Poland being given full independence and thus not really being able to do anything about it. The British would also push for Austria not to gain many lands against the Russians besides Moldova and Poland, as once again they don't want the Austrians to grow much more. Despite Austria mostly being neutral and being far less threatening than the Germans were, far less expansionist than the Germans were, they are still very, very strong here, and the British don't want them getting any ideas of complete European domination. As for what's going to happen in Italy, I honestly see the peninsula just getting divided. This war started a bit earlier than the war in our timeline, and a lot of things would be different. So just for fun, even if you don't like it, I'm going to be creating a separate Italian crown. It's not going to be taking all of Italy, but it's going to take a portion of the north. It's very possible that Sardinia would be created as a separate state under French influence, whilst Austrian Italy would be expanded into much of the rest of the north, quite possibly up to a new papal states. This would create a slightly ugly border, but the British simply can't let them consolidate all of northern Italy. As for the rest of Italy, it would be split in two, a papal states and a southern Italy. The rest of Russia would also be allowed to go free, as the British may even start cozying up with the Russians, something I never thought I'd say, but to counter Austrian strength, it could very well happen, especially as this loss has hurt Nicholas's reputation greatly and may lead to some sort of constitutional republic coming about. It's also likely, however, that Finland would simply gain their independence, not even totally because of the war, but just because of Russian weakness right afterwards, and Austrian pressure to weaken Russia. The French would remain a reasonable Austrian ally, however, their control of the Rhine, a region that Austria greatly wants, and Piedmont, or whatever you want to call that, would anger Austria greatly, as these are territories that they want for themselves. The Ottomans could go either way. I could see them allying with the Austrians or the British, but with the British putting significant pressure on them, I'm going to give it to... Actually, no. I'm going to give it to the Austrians. I'm kind of changing my mind as I go here, but it's just for fun. The Ottomans are actually going to stay aligned with the Austrians and close in their alliance even more. They're not necessarily a part of Europe. They're not necessarily close to Austria. They don't need to be integrated into Austrian plans. Similarly, the Bulgarians would stay allied with them, getting promised lands in Greece and just general economic strength. Let's make this look a bit nicer. We're going to make Austrian allies a nice little darker blue over here. It would include Albania, Bulgaria, and the Ottomans, a lot of southern territories. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and make these Austrian integrated lands in Italy, Illyria, Hungary, Poland, and Romania into a slightly lighter blue. This is what the world now looks like. Austria stands as a major power in Central Europe, having united Germany and controlling a lot of other territories under their new state. However, the British and the French continue to hold out in the West, and the Russians stand as a staunch enemy to the Austrians. Now, I could end it here. The Austrians are in a good position, and they would slowly consolidate the rest of Europe into their alliance. However, I want to end it off with another quick war, in which the Austrians will be going up against the British, the French, and the Russians all at once. This may seem crazy, because it sort of is. However, I honestly see this as a possibility. The Austrians have gotten very strong. They are complete enemies with the Russians, and if the British decide to abandon them, that could very well end it all. Down in the south, the Ottomans would have a lot more trouble pushing against the Austrians than they did in the previous war, as despite being much stronger and after Austrian help, probably much more stable as well, the British would be putting pressure from Egypt and Kuwait. I'm not going to map Africa, but it would generally be the Austrians trying their best to defend the lands and the British and French slowly taking them. The Papal States would be quickly captured, and the French would be pushed back to the Alps in northern Italy, as the Austrians simply have an advantage here. In the Rhineland, similarly, the Austrians would manage to push all the way down south to actual Alsace, as many of the people of Europe would start to look at this Austrian state not as a conqueror, but as a new and better option, as they would be quickly modernizing, and by pooling together the resources of all of these nations, assuming, and this is assuming that their government changed, because I don't know if I've mentioned it, but that is an assumption I've been making. Without a better government, none of this would have been possible, but assuming they do go into sort of a constitutional monarchy like the British one, this could very well continue to expand. Meanwhile, in Russian, pro-Austrian rebellions would break out in the Baltics and most importantly in Ukraine. This would greatly harm Russian supply, and it would just hurt them overall. Meanwhile, Finland would join up with the Austrian alliance, as the Austrians had pushed for their independence sooner, and the Russians were posturing as if to invade Finland going into the future. We may see, however, that the Austrians do gain an enemy in the south, as Greece would likely join against them. This wouldn't do much, however, as the British would send them some aid, but with the large and strong Bulgarian army, along with the help of the powerful Albania, can I not talk? With the help of Albania, they would quickly crush the state, although I do see resistance in Athens holding out, and quite possibly resistant efforts in the mountains as well. Greece would quickly fall beneath Bulgaria and Albania. Over in the west, the Austrians would see a sort of stalemate against the French. This would only be about 10 years after World War I. Tanks would exist, planes would exist, but they would not be as advanced as we saw them in World War II. Blitzkrieg isn't really a thing quite yet. The war could very well expand into Belgium and Luxembourg, though. Now, which side invades them is a different question. You might expect the Austrians to pull off a Schlieffen, but they really have no reason to do that. They're in a stable position. Although they lack naval strength, they're secure in resources by controlling so much of Europe, and their push into Ukraine is getting them the food that they need. Their navy would not be the best here, but it would be quickly growing as their industry continues to outpace the British greatly. They would also have the support of most of the world, as they didn't start this war. The Russians started it, and the British and French joined in. I even see it as likely that they would continue slow and steady progress into the north. The French would have to know they're going to do something, as the stalemate is simply not something that they want to keep going for very long. In the south along the Alps, nothing can happen. So, although it may be realistic, just for fun, let's go ahead and say that the French are the ones to invade through Belgium. This would greatly anger the British, as they did not want this, they did not ask for this. But frankly, what are they going to do? Are they going to drop out of the war and start helping the Austrians instead? Not very likely. Austrian troops would flood in and stop the French before they could take all of Belgium. The move has failed, they have not managed to push into the Rhineland, and from here the Austrians are simply going to hold the front. Meanwhile, where Austrian efforts are pointed at is in Russia. As I've mentioned, over in the west they are simply holding them back, whilst in western Russia they are seeing significant gains. Especially in Ukraine, they managed to capture most of the region without much effort. We also see down in the Caucasus that the Ottomans are making major pushes. In these last 10-15 years, they have become far more stable, and they managed to capture the Baku oil fields. As the war goes on, oil becomes more and more important. We're seeing a lot of the innovations from before World War II happen as this war is going on, as in tanks, etc., are starting to become more and more powerful. The Austrians would be the first ones to use this, as the French army would be incredibly outdated, and the British would simply not want to send too many troops to France. This would be seen in the Great Belgian Reconquering and in the Great Western Offensive, as mostly Hungarian, Polish, Illyrian, Romanian troops would be left to hold the Russian front after capturing all of that territory, while the main Austrian army heads over to Belgium, over to the west, and starts pushing into France. The incredibly unstable French government would at this point start to collapse. After a major Dunkirk, or encirclement in the north, the French army would be in disarray. They would be falling back, and soon enough, Paris would fall. In real life, this was enough to get the French to surrender. Now, things are very different here, but due to the fact that a lot of French people would be in favor of a simple conditional peace, I do think that the war in the West would end. With this, the Austrians have won. It's as simple as that. They don't have the problem that the Nazis had in our timeline. They still have a powerful industrial base and fairly strong allies to keep things going. After sending troops to the Eastern Front, they would slowly start to pick away at Russian strength, capturing the entirety of the Black Sea and encircling the city of, well, at this point in history, it was Stalingrad. Here it would probably still be called... No, not Stalingrad. Leningrad. At this point, it would probably be called Volgograd or St. Petersburg, depending on the Russian government. Oh my god, what am I saying? I don't know, but the point is, Austria would be winning, and soon enough, the British and the Russians would be forced to sign a peace treaty. In it, the Ottomans would gain all of Azerbaijan, and likely a lot of lands along the Black Sea as well. This would destroy the Russians into the future, as the Baku oil fields, along with the Mesopotamian oil fields, etc., would now be going to helping the Austrians and the Ottomans rather than the British and the Russians. The Russians could go either way. They could go extremely extremist as the communist parts of their government take over, or their people could rise up wanting something more similar to what Austria has and start to align with them more and more. Over in the west, the Austrians would take all of Alsace-Lorraine, and Luxembourg would willingly integrate into them as the French occupation practically destroyed the nation. They would now join up with Austria directly. As for Belgium, it would seize significant lands in northern France, and would also be integrated into Austria, however as a separate state, similar to Hungary or any of those. These land losses for the French would be fairly crippling, however not the end of their state as they had hoped. The Italians would be allowed to mostly unify, as southern Italy would remain as independent. They would take the Papal States and become sort of a Catholic naval state down in southern Europe. They would remain as an ally to the Austrians, however this would cement Italian split between the north and the south, which Austria would be fine with, as they really don't want any one of their states getting too strong, or else it could start to push for more autonomy or change in ways. The northern state may, however, be given lands from the French, as they simply didn't take enough in the north, and they do not want France coming back to attack them in the future or becoming an enemy again in the future. Britain would see no losses, perhaps some colonial losses, as the Austrians may do a similar thing in Central Africa, creating semi-independent governments while still having overall control. From here, Austria can do whatever they want. If they want to, they can easily pressure Denmark into returning some German lands. They can take whatever they want from the Russians, and there is not much that they can do about it, frankly. They may even seize some lands from their controlled puppets, such as Danzig from the Polish. Honestly, they may never have given this to them in the first place, especially if they are going to keep Eastern Prussia. As for the East itself, we would see a Lithuanian state be created and unified with Poland, as Poland would be allowed to create Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth once more, in return for giving up these lands. In the Baltics, a new state would be created between Latvia and Estonia, who would also join the Union. Over in Ukraine, same story. A new state would be created, which would join the Union. Every single one of these states adds additional resources, and even if they're not the richest lands, it does strengthen their control significantly over Europe. At this point, they have united a large portion of the continent, possibly, actually, yes, a majority of the continent, not counting all these Russian lands. So it's very possible they would be renaming to the EU. After this war, we're at about 1950, and as the years go on, they would continue to federalize and regain power. This is a completely different world, and frankly, I just did this for fun because I think it would have been awesome to see an Austrian-led EU through a federal model because of what they had, where they had a ton of minorities. We just needed to give them a little power boost to do that. With that, I almost forgot. Bulgaria and Albania, of course, they seize Greek lands, and the rest of Greece, despite not being directly connected to Austria, would be turned into a state, as with the Bulgarians and Albanians being very close, and slowly over time, with the Bulgarians and Albanians would even be integrated in. The Albanians first, and eventually the Bulgarians would also be integrated as a state of the Austrian Empire. Southern Italy would be, Switzerland might be one day, Denmark, the Netherlands, all of these smaller states who really can't do anything against these very strong Austria. I am going to end it there, though. This was honestly really fun. There's zero chance this ever happened, but I just thought it was a really interesting idea to see an Austrian-led EU. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see y'all next time. Goodbye.